think about the time frame, which brings us to the whole idea of long run versus short run, which I think is a very important component of demand. And I like to illustrate it using a very simple example, which is, think about something like the demand for gasoline. And think about how we want to think about as economists about the demand for gasoline. So think about, so again, we're going to draw a demand curve. So this can be the quantity of gas here, and the price of gasoline is going to be here. And here's some initial price, P0, Q0. So that's my initial starting point. People are buying this much gas at this price. And then I want to say, well, what would happen if the price of gasoline instead moved up to here? That is, the price of gasoline increased dramatically. And we've seen this happen numerous times in history, right? The price of gasoline goes way up, goes way down. The price of gasoline has been very volatile. And, well, what would happen to consumption? Well, we know the law of demand would tell us that, well, if that's all that happened, that the price of gasoline got more expensive, people buy less gas. Law of demand is going to tell us that. Okay? The answer is, in the short run, they'll buy less gas, but not that much less. That is, the demand for gasoline, at least in the short run, is going to be relatively inelastic. So if I doubled the price of gasoline, which kind of looks like I did here, I might see the quantity of gas go down maybe 10%, something like that. Doubling the price of gasoline would lead people to consume like 10% less gas than they did before. Short run elasticity of demand for gasoline is a pretty small number, maybe like minus 0.1, something like that. Pretty low. All right? Now, a lot of people say it's completely inelastic, which isn't correct. People do conserve on gasoline when the price of gasoline goes up. How do they conserve? What are the major ways in which people can conserve on gasoline? Yeah. Okay, so one of the things people do is they take fewer road trips or shorter road trips. They go on a shorter vacation. They don't drive as far on a vacation as they would have otherwise. Okay, that would be one example. What else? Yeah, they might take the bus or take the subway, walk, do something other than drive. So both of these are drive less, right? You're going to drive less. Again, gives you our analogy we used when we talked about cars and car maintenance. The activity that's being adjusted is driving less. So I would see fewer miles go down. So if we were going to achieve a 10% reduction in gas consumption, do we have to drive 10% fewer miles? Is that the only way we could consume less gas, is drive fewer miles? Okay, but sharing is going to mean less driving, right? Because you two of you in one car rather than each in your own car. So carpooling would go into that drive less category. Yes?
You got to replace their car if they want to be.
Well, yeah, but let's assume that that's hard to do. Let's assume that's de minimis in the short run.
You're less aggressive with the gas.
Okay, you could drive less aggressively. You drive a little slower, right? You accelerate a little less fast when you leave. Yeah, you can do that. So you can get better mileage in your car. Miles per gallon can go up. How else could I achieve more miles per gallon? Yeah.
Buy gas more often, because otherwise you're hauling heavy gasoline around.
Okay.
And I knew that for some of the minivan.
Okay, so putting less gas in your car, because gas weighs something, right? Okay. But then you got to drive to the station. You got to trade that off. Exactly. Well, what else can you do? There's another thing that's happened over time. What? That takes time. I'm leaving that out. Somebody already suggested that. But many households have more than one car, right? That's one of the things that's changed over time. More households now have multiple cars. You can drive a different car. You can drive your better mileage car. Leave the minivan at home and drive the small car. Right? You could still take the same trip. It's just you're going to take your small car to work rather than your big car. Right? You can't necessarily change the composition of cars that we own overnight, but you can change the composition of cars on the road. See, that's the difference, right? Everybody get the difference between the two? It may take time to adjust the car fleet that's in the garage, but the car fleet on the road probably could change instantly, right? We can instantly decide that we're going to take one car rather than the other, right? I mean, literally, you can't do it while you're driving, but you understand. We can much more easily, in the short run, affect what cars we drive. And so that second effect has probably gotten more important as we have more and more multi-car households, right? That is, cars, more ability to adjust which car you drive. But nonetheless, in the short run, there's a limited number of things we can do. Now, what would happen if the price of gasoline stayed up here? What would happen? Yeah. Yeah, or even just smaller, more fuel-efficient cars. And this has been a very important response, historically, of what people have done. Right? When the price of gasoline goes up, what happens? Sales of pickup trucks and things like that tend to go way down, and sales of more fuel-efficient cars go up. We would change the size. Now, you can do other things, too. You can build public transportation. You can move closer to work. You can do all kinds of things to respond that you couldn't do in the short run. So what would happen over time is we would move over to a point, let's call it here. That is, the response to that increase in price would be more elastic in the long run because we can do more substitution. There's more things we can do. Okay? All right. Again, this is where a production function effect is, I think, very useful to think about it, because you can think about it as one of the major things that's going on here is the car fleet is changing, right? That's the idea of the production function approach. It's not some amorphous thing going on in the background. It's something I can see. I can see that the car fleet looks different when I got here than it was here. If you go back to the 1970s in the United States, price of gasoline went way up. And if you looked at like the fleet of cars we had, it changed dramatically from the mid-70s to the early 80s. Basically, the 8-cylinder car basically was out of business by the time you got to the early 80s. Very few 8-cylinder cars being sold. Almost everything moved down to a smaller size engine. Okay? Now, what would happen, though, once we got here? So you might think of this as some long-run demand curve. And here's the short-run demand curve, right? So the short-run demand curve would be very steep. Long-run demand curve would be more elastic. What would happen if now the price was to fall back to where it used to be? In fact, this did happen. What would happen? Where would we go? Yeah.
Well, it depends on how
Just give me the short term. What would happen in the very short term?
slight increase.
Okay, we would move along another short-run demand curve. Right? We would move, there'd be another short-run demand curve that would be, again, less elastic. Because, again, just think of it simply, the fleet of cars is being held constant along that curve, right? Okay, now what would happen?
Whether we go, it's going to go back up, but whether we go right back is going to depend on whether we stayed at the high gas prices long enough.
Okay, let's assume we went here, we moved over here, we came down here. Now, we're going to move back to the right, just like we moved back to the left. And I think what you're asking is, will we go all the way back to here, right? Well, why not? Yeah.
Well, if we haven't changed technology at all,
What do you mean by, is it all about technology? It's really not about technology. It's really about, have we changed things
in some way, something that's
permanent, some kind of permanent change to the world. And I think what's amazed people in the car market is how far back we actually came. Because when the 80s came around, when prices went way up, people said, wow, we became much more fuel conscious, we became much more energy efficient, we got rid of those big gas guzzling cars. Those are gone, they're never coming back. Then gas got cheap, and what happened? What happened to the 8-cylinder car that was kind of a dinosaur? It came back, right? The 8-cylinder car came back. There's a lot of cars that had, 10-cylinder cars came back, right? We got, right? We had a big taste for, we didn't just say, well, this is permanent, we're never changing. In fact, we brought back a lot of gas guzzling type cars, okay? Now, technology did change. Engines are much more efficient than they used to be. And in fact, engines are much more efficient than they were. But what do we use that efficiency for?
Make more power.
More power, more performance. Performance of cars has gone up enormously. I mean, a Honda Civic is a high-performance car by historical standards. I mean, engines have become, we have a very elastic demand for performance. And you know, as prices of gas came down, we found, yeah, we have this new technology, but we didn't use that much of it really to save on gas. We used a lot of it for performance. So it's, you got to be careful. Now, I agree, you don't necessarily come all the way back. The key notion, though, is there's a lot more adjustment that happens in the long run than can't happen in the short run. And this turns out to be very important for many goods. Because while you may not necessarily respond much initially, you can respond a lot more as you got more and more things that you can change. Okay? And the cars and gasoline is a really good example of that. Are we holding prices constant? So let me say probably not. And let me show you how we can do this. All right? So let me show you how I'm going to make this work. In other words, what I held constant here to here was not, I held the quantity of cars constant. Think of it that way, right? I held cars constant. So let me think about a demand system, right? So let's think about, I got X gas, which depends on the price of gas, price of cars, a bunch of other stuff, right? And I got X cars, depends on the price of gas, price of cars, a bunch of other stuff, right? So this is XG, XC, right? That's the way I'm thinking about my equilibrium, right? I'm thinking about my equilibrium as a quantity of gasoline consumed, depends on the demand for gas, the amount of cars consumed depends on this, right? So the long run, partial XG, partial PG, long run is just equal to partial X gas, partial P gas. Right? That's it. The long run response says hold prices constant. How does the quantity of gas respond to its price when people can freely adjust all the other goods? And importantly, freely adjust their cars. Okay? Now, how could I use these demand curves to talk about a short run effect? Okay? So what I'm going to say is different about the short run is I'm not going to let people change the quantity of cars. Right? I'm going to assume that rather than being able to buy as many cars as they want at the fixed price, that in fact the quantity of cars is held fixed in the short run. Right? That is, the fleet of cars is the same tomorrow as it was today. Right? So how would I do that using these demand curves? Well, how is it in a market economy I could hold the quantity of cars fixed as the price of gas goes up? Price of gas is rising. People are going to say, geez, I want fewer cars. I'm going to try to sell my car. So in that market, what's going to have to happen to hold the quantity of cars constant? Well, think about it. What am I going to have to do in that economy to keep the quantity of cars where it was? People want fewer of them. I'm going to have to reduce the price of cars. I'm going to have to make cars cheaper to make people want to hold them. Right? So what I'm going to get dxg short run equals partial x gas, partial p gas, plus partial x gas, partial p cars, dp cars. Right? So that's going to be the first equation, because I'm going to let the price of cars move. Remember, before I was holding the price of cars constant. Now I'm going to let it move. And then for the car equation, I'm going to get 0, right? Because I'm not going to let the quantity of cars change. It has to be equal to the price x cars partial p gas plus partial x cars partial p cars dp cars. So the price of cars is going to have to adjust so as to hold the quantity of cars fixed. Okay? So that's going to imply dp cars is equal to minus x cars partial price of gas divided by partial x cars partial p cars. Okay? So what does it say? Well, if cars are complements for gas, then as the price of gas goes up, I want fewer cars. Right? So this is negative. This is negative by the law of demand. And this is negative because it's a minus sign. So 3 negatives make a negative, which says, lo and behold, the price of car is going to have to go down, which is what we said. The price of car is going to have to fall to induce people to hold the same stock of cars they had. I can then substitute that in here, and I get dxg x gas short run equals partial x gas partial p gas minus partial x gas x gas partial p cars times partial x cars partial p gas divided by partial x gas partial p gas. All right? So now, remember before, this term is negative, right? This is the own price long run effect. So that's a negative term. What's the sign of this second term, including the minus sign? Well, this one's negative, this one's negative, this one's negative, and this one's negative. 4 negatives now. 4 negatives makes a positive. So that means that this short run effect is going to be smaller than the long run effect. Right? Because it's going to be muted by this second term. Right? It's going to be muted because as the price of gas goes up, people want to buy fewer cars, but the price of cars is going to go down, which is going to induce them to hold more cars than they otherwise would, which is going to hold up the demand for gas. Right? Demand for gas will stay up because people are still consuming as many cars as they were before. Right? People understand how that works. So that's the basic mechanism by which this short-run demand is going to be less elastic than the long-run demand. Okay. People understand that? Yeah.
Is there a typo in there?
What? Go ahead.
Is there a typo? I mean, could be in the denominator could be d car x car.
Oh, I'm sorry. This should be X cars. Sorry. It's not a typo. It's a random notation. Cars. Yeah. No, it should have been cars and cars. Still the same sign, still negative. So that's kind of the point. It's going to be, this whole term is going to be positive. All right? Any questions? Yeah?
Does that only work if you can close that curve to come to, on the top diagram, you come back to the initial?
No, that's just saying that this curve here is
When it
steeper
drops-
than that
When
one.
it drops down again, you may not be on the same long run curve, you may shoot past that.
Well, it won't generally shoot past it. Generally, most stories people tell are reasons that you would come up short.
Okay.
Because you're not going to rebuild everything you had before. There's going to be some permanent changes that are not going, you will have made some adjustments to conserve gas that you won't. Now, the key point was you actually might go past it for the reason I talked about. You became more efficient, and when you became more efficient, you could actually now produce higher performance, and you might have such an elastic demand for performance that you actually consume more gas than you would have before. You could actually go past for that
I'm
reason.
saying if you can't close the curve, those partials may not work out.
Well, these partials, think of it as at a point. The partials are right around that point, saying that curve is steeper than the other one. That's kind of what the partials are working at. Yeah.
Where are we using that savings when you start, the one starts these peaks?
We used it here. That is, when we calculated how much the price of cars had to change, we did that in order to hold the quantity of cars fixed. That was the trick. We said, rather than hold the price of cars fixed, which is the usual way we look at demand, let's think about holding the quantity of cars fixed. Now, we can do that because we could just say, well, price has got to adjust enough so as to hold the quantity fixed. That's kind of the intermediation. Now, in the real world, what would happen is actually not all cars would get cheaper. Fuel-efficient cars might go up in price, and gas guzzlers might get cheaper. That is, you might have things that are substitutes for gas, not complements. But it turns out that goes the same way. Because what if I looked at what would be different if this other good was a substitute rather than a complement? What would be different? Well, this term would be the opposite sign. This term would now be positive. But if this term was positive, that term also would likely be positive. That is, they would be substitutes both ways, and the result would still follow. Right? Because it would be minus, one minus, two negatives, and now two positives. So as long as the cross partials are the same sign, that is, when one's a complement for the other, they're complements in the other direction, or substitutes and vice versa, you're going to have this effect that it's going to be more elastic in the long run than it would be in the short run. Because basically what's going to happen, the price of this good goes down, you try to buy less complements, makes complements cheaper, which preserves the demand for this good. You try to run and buy more substitutes, they get more expensive, which also preserves demand for this good, right? So whether it's substitutes going up in price or complements getting cheaper, the net effect on this good is always the same. It reduces your ability to get away from this good, right? Everybody understands? Yes?
I have a question about the diagram at the top.
What would you say the key aspect of addiction is? Time inconsistency. Why do you say it has anything to do with time inconsistency?
We can easily suppose that when you get addicted, you become another person.
Why do you need to go to that? Why can't we do addiction within like the standard model? What facts about the world would not be explicable with the standard consumption model? So let's think about addiction from the point of view of neoclassical economics and how we would approach addiction. Yeah. Okay.
Per day, I need a certain quantity, and then
So food is addictive because if you need your food every day. You say food is addictive in that regard? Would you say heat is addictive and If I live in a cold environment, I'll freeze to death if I don't have it, so I pretty... But is that what we mean by addiction? Is that really, like you said, well, an addictive good is a good I really have to have? That's not really what we mean by addiction, right? Because you really want to even define, yeah.
Perhaps instead define it as like the utility of consumption depends not on like how much you're consuming right now, but the stock of your history of consumption, at least for some like recent period.
Yeah, I think addiction, I agree with you. I think that's the where I would start with addiction. I would start with addiction as something that says where past consumption matters for my consumption decisions today. That how much I've consumed in this good in the past feeds into consumption today. So the model that Gary and I did was we said, well, think about there being a stock of consumption, past consumption, and that stock of consumption is just your standard that is my stock that I have is just whatever the stock was yesterday. Well, let me just do it this one. Let me do it that way. I'll lag it to make it a little easier. So the stock I start today with is the stock I started yesterday depreciated plus whatever I consumed last period. And if you want to make a simple model would be delta equals 1, in which case this is just lag consumption. It's just, and then we think about maximize sum, like discounted sum from t equals 0 to infinity e to the 1 over 1 plus r rho to the t u of c of t s of t. So think about that. That's just a standard discounted utility model, time separable utility. And this utility at a given point in time depends on the stock of past consumption. Okay? And the idea of addiction, at least at a minimum, you might think of UCS as positive, right? That is, the more I've consumed in the past, the higher the marginal utility of consumption is today. Some idea of reinforcement. Okay? That the utility I get from consuming today is of the good is a function of past consumption. Okay? That's the simplest idea. Now, it turns out that's not sufficient to actually lead to anything that we would normally call addictive behavior. So let's say you thought about the following model. So first, think about what's key in this model. Think about UC. UC is the marginal utility of current consumption. Usually we're going to think that that's positive. What about US? Is US positive or negative? How would you think about it? The partial derivative of utility today with respect to past consumption. Negative? Always? Can you think of an addictive good for which this might be positive? Exercise. That if I exercised more in the past, raises my demand to exercise today. So maybe the cost of exercising today is lower, and I'm better off if I exercise. So the US less than 0, we call this a harmful addiction. And US greater than 0, beneficial addiction. And this is defined this is not about its effect on future consumption. It's really just about its effect on future utility. These are what we think of as level effects. This is the effect of past consumption on today's level of utility. So, if this is heroin consumption, C is heroin consumption, then you might say, well, US is negative. If I've been consuming a lot of heroin, I'm going to be in worse shape today than if I hadn't been. If this is exercise or this is, past consumption of music or something like that, I might be in better shape the more I've consumed this good in the past. And so, but it turns out addiction doesn't have much to do with this, sign of this. That is, the sign of this term isn't really about addiction. Because in general, in economics, what really matters in a model like this is the cross derivatives, right? That is how marginal utilities are affected. But what is the marginal utility of a consumption in a model like this? Does anybody know? What would be the marginal utility of consuming a unit of C in a world like this? What would be the effect of an extra unit of consumption today on your discounted lifetime utility? Well, what would you get? Well, you'd get 1 over 1 plus rho to the t, u sub c evaluated at t, right? That is, if I consumed an extra unit of the good, I would get that amount, right? But would that be it? No. I would start 1 over 1 rho to the t plus 1 us, right? Because my s would be 1 unit higher next period. I consume a unit of the good today. That increases my stock next period by 1. Then it would be 1 over 1 plus rho to the t plus 2. Now there would be a 1 minus delta because that some of that extra consumption would depreciate away. us, this would be at t plus 1. This would be at t plus 2 plus dot, 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 right? Where these terms would all be getting smaller because they would all be multiplied by a 1 minus delta over 1 plus rho. Right? All right, everybody see that? So now how would a higher S, well, how would a higher S affect this marginal utility? How would S entering affect this marginal utility? Yeah. Okay, so it would lower, well, how do we know? No, this is now you're talking levels, right? You're saying what's the level of this? So a harmful addiction, these terms are going to be negative, right? Right. So a harmful addiction is going to be defined by, well, I maybe enjoy consuming this today, but I'm going to have this future harm. So an immediate consequence of rational addiction is that people are going to be forward-looking. They're going to think about the future, not just about the past, right? Because we think about addiction as saying, if you consume more in the past, that's going to affect me today. Well, a rational person is then going to have to say, if I consume more today, that's going to affect me in the future. So a key implication of rational addiction is that you're going to take account of those future effects.
I'm just trying to understand the condition use of CS greater than 0. So my, on the other word.
That's not going to be sufficient. That's what I'm going to show you why in a minute.
I'm just trying to understand what it means.
Okay?
So comparing two people, one with a low.
You're asking, if you raise S, how does that change the marginal utility of consumption?
And it increases the marginal utility of consumption?
Well, that would be usually what we think. That is, I get more marginal utility. The extra gain I get from consuming this commodity is higher the higher the past consumption is. Right?
But one, at least an understanding of how addictive drugs work is that kind of the longer you've been addicted, the less effective they are.
But then why do you consume more? It has to be the marginal. The lower the level of utility, I think that's the way to think about it. But in order to get you to consume more, they have to raise the bang for your buck relative at least to other goods. Right? That is, why do they lead me to consume more? Right? This is like, I think what's confusing you is the same thing that always happens with technological progress. Right? That is, if you have technical progress in a given activity, does that raise or lower the demand for inputs? Well, you don't know, right? Because it's a marginal versus average kind of story, right? As we become more productive at making a given commodity, do we need more labor or less labor? Well, for a given, you get more output, but the output's worth less, okay? So what's happening in this case is the way we think about an addictive good is what makes a good addictive? Well, if I've consumed it in the past, then I consume more today. That's the empirical observation of what we're going to call addictive. I smoked cigarettes in the past, and if I smoked in the past, I'm more likely to smoke today. The more I smoked in the past, the more I'm going to smoke today. That's what we mean by addictive, I think. If I've consumed cocaine, I'm more likely to consume cocaine again. Right? That's, I think, what we mean by addictive, right? Or no?
I mean, well, I mean, that's one way to define it. I think you could also define it in chemical terms, but it just seems like kind of in that sense, like someone who's very addicted to a drug and consumes the same amount of it as someone who's not as addicted to the drug gets not as much benefit.
Yeah, but that just means US is, that means holding C fixed. Higher S means less, let's call it utility. Let's just assume B is what you call the benefit of, right? And you're telling me I got B of C and S, right? Where this is current consumption, that's past consumption. And what you told me is holding C constant, the more I consumed in the past, the less B I get, right? That has nothing to do, that's a different issue than B sub CS. B sub CS is a different question. That story that I got less benefit is that S has a negative effect on my total benefit, right? As opposed to S has a negative effect on the marginal benefit, right? All right, and that's the key of an addictive subject. A harmful addiction has that kind of feel to it, right? I consume in the past. The more I've consumed in the past, the worse off I am, but the only way to not be so worse off is to consume even more. So you're thinking about B sub S negative, but B sub CS is positive, so that the benefit I get from consuming more goes up. So I actually consume more in equilibrium, right? That's kind of the distinction between the two. You really want to distinguish the level effect from the cross effect. And this is true for lots of problems. People confuse this all the time. Let me give you an example. Think about what's the effect of my neighbor having a faster car on my demand to have a faster car, right? Let's say you thought about that. There's my utility depends on my car speed and my neighbor's speed. Okay? Think about that world. Now, people often have these kind of rat race kind of models where they think about, people care about not just what their car is, but how fast their neighbor's car is, right? And the usual story is what? What do you infer from the fact that there's an effect of my neighbor's? Let's assume we see when my neighbor gets a faster car, I want a faster car, right? Let's assume that's what I see. Does that mean my neighbor has a negative externality on me? Because he makes me go spend more on a car when he has a faster car? Can you infer it's a negative externality? No, there's nothing about that observation. There's nothing about the observation that says I want a faster car than when he has a faster car that tells me there's a negative externality. It just says my willingness to pay for a faster car goes up when he has a faster car, right? It's about changes in my willingness to pay with respect to his consumption. Right? You cannot infer that it's a negative externality from the fact that him having a faster car makes me want to have a faster car. Right? That just means that there are complements in consumption. That it doesn't tell me it's a negative externality. Yeah.
So the argument would be like you enjoy your car being fast more when you have a fast car would be the like case where it would actually be a positive externality.
Yeah. exactly. All right? How would you address the other question, whether it's a negative externality or not? Well, ask people is a terrible way. But let's say, do people like having friends with fast cars? They like to have friends with slow cars. They really do. People go out like looking for, God, I want to hang out with that guy. He's got a shitty car. That really makes me feel good. I actually don't think that's how people behave. People like, yeah, man, that guy's got a Maserati, man. I want to know that guy. I want to hang out with him. You know? What? I don't think that's the behavior you see. I think people don't grab it. They don't go around looking for. Do people really go out and try to find it? Like, I want to live in this neighborhood with all these people who have nothing, because that's going to make me feel great. I don't see people behaving that way. I see them going on TV and want to see homes that are rich and famous and all this crap, right? That's what sells. They don't say, here's the TV show that'll show you how bad people live. And won't that make you feel fortunate?
The most famous episode of MTV's Cribs is when they visit Red Man's home on Staten Island, and it's a dump.
Yeah, but okay. But is that really the dominant thing that happens on TV? That you see that there people really are constantly going out there to show them how much the common man is doing better than the other people? That I'm going to show you all these people who live worse than you? That's not what we see. Yeah.
What might be confusing to me here is it feels like utility function changes when you observe daily gas consumption such that you.
Why do we need it to change?
I don't know if we need it, but that's.
What do you mean by it changes, okay? What do you mean by it changes? What's the difference between saying my utility function varies with his speed and his speed enters my utility function? What is the difference between those two models? Is there any difference between those two models? Be saying, I got U of speed, and then I got this thing that shifts the utility function, versus I got a utility function with two arguments. What's the difference between the two? I don't know if there is much of a difference, other than I like the one that has both arguments because I can talk about choices that you can't talk about with the other one. Like in the other one, how do you talk about my choice of whether to, if I could affect his speed, what would I want to choose? Well, I don't know. I think people do have effects on what other people choose. They try to influence who they deal with. They try to influence what other people choose. Yeah.
You've heard this like question when they ask people like, would you rather make $100,000 and everybody else make $80,000, or would you rather make like $200 real dollars and everybody else make $300,000?
Yeah, so people ought to go move to poor places where they can feel like kings. And I just don't see that's the behavior that I see most people engaged in. Right? I mean, I see most people going the other way. They want to go hang out with watch all the rich guys, and vicariously consume through them. Those shows have gotten more popular. Yeah.
I was just going to say that in terms of those studies, we see that people want some kind of equality in their pay, so they would actually take less money to be closer to the average than take more money and be further away from the average.
How much they're willing to pay to do this?
I don't think it's been studied in like the whole salary chunk.
I mean, I think it's much better not to ask people, but to actually see what choices people make.
So it's done in terms of short-term contracts for hourly employees. This is how it's been experimented, and see what kind of contracts they take. So they know they're not going to be tied to this for years, but it's maybe a few weeks or a few months.
Yeah, then I think, but I think what we really want to explain is the actual choices that we see people making. I guess that's the question I really go to. And I'm not saying it's irrational for people to prefer to live with people. I mean, that's perfectly consistent. I'm just saying you want to start asking the question. If you want to get at what's the sign, right? What's the sign of this with respect to this? That's one question. There's a whole other question, which is how does S affect this marginal utility? Now, you can see why UCS being positive isn't sufficient, right? Because what happens if I raise S at date t? Well, raising S at day t is going to give me a UCS here, but it's going to give me a bunch of USS terms going forward, right? And if USS is negative, so that the marginal benefit of S, if it's positive, goes down the more S I have, or the marginal cost of S gets more negative if it's already negative, then that's going to go the other way. That's going to tend to make these things substitutes rather than complements. So it turns out in order to get complementarity, that is to get it so past consumption reinforces future consumption, you need something stronger than UCS being positive. You need that UCS is positive, but sufficiently positive that it outweighs this USS term. That basically there's a negative built-in effect of rising marginal cost or diminishing marginal benefit. And that's the kind of condition you need in these addiction models. Now, what it turns out is these addiction models can be pretty strong. They can mean that if you make a plot, you might have a world that looks like this, where here's S, and then here's C equals delta S, right? So that's what? That's the steady state line, right? There's a steady state where C equals delta S. And then these addiction models give you some kind of like upward sloping C of S function. That is, the amount you consume can depend on the stock that you have, how much you've consumed in the past. And upward sloping is kind of almost like the definition of addiction. The more you've consumed in the past, the more you're going to consume in the future. So then what happens if you like change prices? Well, if you change prices, what happens is C goes up. So this is C0 bar. This is C1 in the short run. And then eventually you go up to here, C1 bar, right? So if you like lower prices, that'll shift this schedule upward. Call this C0 of S, C1 of S. And so what happens is you get this bigger long-run response than you get a short-run response. So that would be kind of like the classic addiction model. It sort of says, if you reduce prices of the addictive good, people will consume more like they would for any other good, but then over time, they'll consume more and more as that reinforces itself, right? Because your S is going to go up, and that S is going to feed future consumption. Okay, this is where they're complements. CT and CT minus 1 are complements. It would be a dynamics. It's a little bit like what we had with capital in the neoclassical growth model, right? We had an impact initially of technical change, and then we reinforced that over time. All right? Now, you could also think about this as like, you know, the way we dealt with addiction, we made this S like unobservable. It was just a stock that was running around in the background that we couldn't measure directly. We could infer its presence by behavior, but we couldn't measure it directly. You could make S much more observable. Like you could, one thing you might say is gasoline is addictive, right? Why is gasoline somewhat addictive? What happens? Think about it. What happens when the price of gas goes down? Well, price of gas goes down, people consume more gas. But then they start buying less fuel-efficient cars and all that stuff, and then we work our way up to the new long-run effect. In that case, you might say S is like the stock of cars. S is an observable quantity in that case. S is the stock of cars. Now, it's not perfectly collinear with consumption, but nonetheless, it's going to behave in much the same way. Now, one thing that's interesting that can happen when you get an addictive good is these curves can be so upward sloping that you might have a picture that looks like this. So this is C of S, and this is C equals delta S here. Now, how is consumption going to behave in this world? Yeah, that is, if you start to the right of S star, then consumption's going to exceed depreciation, and you're going to move to the right. And if you start to the left of here, you're going to go down and eventually quit. Right? So that would be an example of what we call an unstable steady state. That is, depending on whether your stock starts above or below this critical level S star, you're going to go up, or you're going to go up if you start above, you're going to go down if you're not. So people might start out pretty similarly. One guy consumes a little more than the other guy initially, but over time, they're going to go further and further apart. Some people are going to go towards zero, while other people are going to go up to a positive steady state level of consumption. You can even build models where consumption grows forever, where you just keep consuming more and more forever. Now, that's kind of a bit unrealistic in the sense that, we don't really see that happen in practice, but you can certainly build theoretical models along those lines. All right? Yeah. Well, I mean, one idea to think about rehabilitation is it could shift this function to some extent. One way to think about rehabilitation is it shifts this function down so that I get below this state, and then I go down enough that even when it shifts back up, I'm, right, like take the guy here who would have gone up. If I could shift this curve down temporarily, maybe it goes like that, well, now he's going to head downward. And then even if he eventually gets out of rehab, as long as he's gotten far enough down, he's depreciated that past consumption enough, maybe I only get him to here. So he comes back up, but eventually he's going to get off it because I kind of rehabilitate. So it's the potential for rehabilitation that comes in. Now the question is, why is it rational to have rehabilitation? And the answer is, well, it has to lower the cost of quitting. It has to make it less costly to do during that short term, or has to have some effect, otherwise you wouldn't do it. But the idea of how it would work, I think, is pretty much built into the model of how rehabilitation would work. Yeah? Is that you can reduce my access to good ways to quit, because one might not be able to avail myself of these quitting alternatives without exposing myself to some risk of prosecution, for example. Another example is, in order to avoid prosecution and other things, I might have to distance myself from family and other people who might be able to help me quit in general. None of those things I don't think of as good, because they raise the cost of quitting. So I think you might really want to think about those kinds of things before you make an addictive substance illegal, because it actually could reduce people's ability to quit. Now, having the ability to quit is a double-edged sword, right? Because we talked about this the other day. The easier I make it to quit, the more people will start. I think that's almost an unambiguous implication of economics, right? And that as soon as I tell you I'm going to make it easier for you to quit, you're less worried about getting addicted. And that could ultimately be so strong that more people end up addicted when you make it easier to quit, right? It's an elasticity question. Is the elasticity of starting greater than sort of the elasticity of quitting? So you get even more of a response on the starting side. It's like, if I make an activity safer, will more people die or fewer people die with the activity? Well, it depends on how elastic demand is. If demand is sufficiently elastic and I make it safer, then more people will do it, and I could get so many more people doing it that the total number of deaths would go up rather than down, right? If you wanted to think about it in terms of a price, you would just need the demand to be sufficiently elastic. So if the risk of death is half the price, you'd basically need the elasticity to be bigger than 2. Yeah?